She was just a nobody in row 9, until the pilot called her by a code name to save the plane. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know which city you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a story. Now, sit back and enjoy. Clara sat alone in row 9, by the window, staring out at the expanse of clouds below. She was dressed in a worn gray hoodie that seemed to have seen better days, her pale face framed by unkempt hair. Her eyes, a pale blue, gazed down at the landscape below but were distant, lost in thought. Her demeanor was quiet, even still, a stark contrast to the usual buzz of passengers during a flight. To the flight attendants, she appeared to be just another nervous first-time flyer, someone trying to brace herself for the unknown. Sarah, one of the attendants, passed by and took note of Clara's behavior. Sarah assumed she might be afraid of flying, so she didn't pay much attention, continuing her rounds as usual. But Clara was something more than what Sarah expected. Her silence wasn't one of fear but rather one of composure, of a calm that was unsettling in the chaos of air travel. Sarah moved on, noting the unusual quietness of the woman, unaware that she was being drawn into a story that would unfold before her. When the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, asking if any pilots were on board, it caused a brief stir. Clara's hand moved slowly to the call button, pressing it with quiet precision. The intercom immediately asked all passengers to remain seated and calm, but something in Clara's expression caught Sarah off guard. She approached the woman, her smile tight but professional. "Ma'am, please stay seated," Sarah said, her voice sugary but carrying a certain edge. "There's no need to panic." Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply stared at Sarah, her eyes calm yet intense. It was then that Sarah noticed the small bag in Clara's lap, a cloth bag that had seen better days. It was the kind you'd find at a flea market, frayed at the edges but still intact. Clara's fingers rested lightly on the bag, but it was enough to make Sarah pause. Clara, a figure that looked so unremarkable, was not at all what she seemed. The plane rocked slightly, and Sarah's eyes shifted to the other passengers. A businessman in row 5, wearing a sharp suit and a gleaming Rolex, snickered at the situation. "What is this, a movie?" he laughed, drawing attention. But before anyone could respond, the intercom crackled again. It wasn't the usual message, it was different, strange. "Ghost talk. If you're listening, please come to the cockpit." The words hung in the air, and the cabin froze. Clara remained still, her gaze never wavering. The laughter in the cabin died down as eyes turned to her. What was happening? Why had Clara been singled out? The plane's cabin was filled with tension. Every passenger seemed to hold their breath as the strange words echoed through the speakers. Clara remained seated for a moment longer, her fingers gently gripping the worn edges of her cloth bag. Her pale blue eyes met the curious stares of several passengers, yet she didn't react. A ripple of uncertainty spread through the cabin, and the stillness felt almost suffocating. For a brief second, it seemed like time had stopped. Sarah, the flight attendant, hesitated. She'd been trained to handle every emergency scenario, but this felt different. The calmness of Clara, the mysterious request over the intercom, it was something she wasn't prepared for. She stepped closer, forcing a polite smile, but her voice, though gentle, betrayed her unease. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her tone firmer now, "I'm sure you didn't mean to press that button." She paused, then added with a touch of hesitation, "Please stay seated. There's no need for alarm." Clara's gaze remained steady, unwavering. Slowly, she lifted her head, locking eyes with Sarah for the briefest of moments. There was no panic in Clara's eyes, only a quiet determination, as though she knew exactly what was unfolding. Her fingers tightened slightly around the black metal piece she had pulled from her bag earlier, a small object that had gone unnoticed by the other passengers. It was no bigger than a credit card, but its weight, its presence, was undeniable. A man in row 5, Jason, leaning toward the aisle, let out a loud snort. "What is this, some kind of hero moment?" he chuckled, his eyes scanning the cabin. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, and a ripple of laughter spread through the nearby rows. "Missed her bus to the shelter, maybe," he added, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. The laughter only seemed to deepen Clara's calm. She didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the taunts. Instead, she slipped off her scuffed sneakers and stood, her bare feet making no sound against the carpet. With a measured pace, she began walking down the aisle, each step deliberate, as if she were walking through a memory she didn't want to disturb. The passengers continued to watch her, whispers following in her wake. Sarah followed behind, heels clicking nervously on the floor. "Ma'am, please," she said, her voice rising now, tinged with authority. "This is for qualified personnel only." The words were firm, but there was no real conviction in her tone. Clara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her gaze was fixed ahead, her steps purposeful as she passed rows of passengers, each one sizing her up. The atmosphere in the cabin was electric with anticipation, the tension rising as Clara made her way toward the cockpit. As Clara continued down the aisle, the air in the cabin grew thicker with tension. Passengers' eyes followed her every move, some in quiet curiosity, others with open judgment. A few passengers whispered to each other, exchanging looks of disbelief, while others were too stunned to speak. The silence in the cabin was nearly suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of the plane and the occasional creak of the overhead compartments. Sarah, the flight attendant, was struggling to keep up. Her professional demeanor was faltering, replaced by a nervous energy she couldn't quite mask. Every step Clara took felt like an accusation. Sarah's voice trembled as she approached again, though her words were firm, still trying to maintain control. "Ma'am, I must insist that you return to your seat. This is for authorized personnel only," she said, trying to sound in control but only half believing it herself. Clara didn't respond, not verbally, at least. She didn't need to. With her head held high and a calm resolve that was unnerving, she moved forward with a sense of purpose, unshaken by the growing unease in the cabin. Her bare feet made no sound on the carpet, and her every movement seemed deliberate, as if she was in a place beyond anyone's ability to stop her. A man in row 5, who had been quiet up until this point, finally spoke up. Jason, dressed in a sharp suit and with a confidence that seemed out of place in the turbulent atmosphere of the plane, leaned toward the aisle. "What's this? Some kind of hero moment?" he sneered. His voice was loud enough for everyone in the cabin to hear, and his words dripped with mockery. "She looks like she missed her bus to the shelter, maybe." His comment sliced through the silence, and a few passengers in nearby rows chuckled. But Clara didn't flinch. She didn't even glance in his direction. Her focus remained on the path ahead, the metal object still clutched in her hand, its weight somehow grounding her in this storm of ridicule. The ripples of laughter only fueled her calm, the taunts becoming background noise to her steady progression toward the cockpit. The woman in row 10, her designer purse glinting in the dim cabin light, leaned over to her friend and whispered loud enough for those nearby to hear. "She probably thinks she's in one of those Tom Hanks movies. You know, the ones where the hero's just some regular person who saves the day." The word stung, cruel and cutting, but Clara didn't flinch. Her footsteps were measured, each one carefully placed, as though she had already stepped through this moment 1,000 times before. As she walked, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some full of judgment, others with pity, but none with the understanding of who she truly was. Sarah trailed behind, the unease growing in her chest. "Ma'am, please," she said again, her voice now strained, but it was clear she had lost control of the situation. She was powerless against Clara's quiet authority. Then, halfway down the aisle, another obstacle appeared. A man in a wrinkled polo shirt, his breath heavy with alcohol, stood up and blocked Clara's path. His words were slurred, but his meaning was clear. "Hey, lady. You think you're a hotshot pilot? Go back to your seat. Let the pros handle this." Clara didn't stop. She didn't even hesitate. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, calm, piercing, unbothered by his drunken mockery. Without a word, she stepped aside, her bare feet gliding over the carpet as she sidestepped the man and continued her journey to the front of the plane. The man, now the focus of the entire cabin's attention, laughed louder, trying to rally the room's support. "See, she's got nothing," he crowed, looking for validation. But it wasn't just Clara who ignored him. No one else laughed. No one else joined in. Instead, the murmurs of disapproval began to grow, from a few scattered passengers, like a quiet tide rising in response to his disrespect. At the front of the cabin, the cockpit door stood open. Clara's goal was clear now. As she passed through the final rows of passengers, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, the energy in the room growing heavier with each step she took. No one had yet realized what she was capable of, what she had come here to do, but they would soon. The door to the cockpit closed behind her with a soft click, and the whispers in the cabin turned to silence, like a switch had been flipped. The storm outside raged on, but the tension in the cabin seemed to pause, waiting for whatever was about to happen next. The calm that had settled over the cockpit was brief. The storm outside continued to batter the plane, the violent winds shaking the aircraft with increasing intensity. The air pressure shifted, the right wing dipped, and the plane's instruments flickered. Inside the cockpit, the tension was palpable once again. Clara's fingers hovered over the auxiliary controls, her eyes scanning the array of lights and dials as if they were familiar, as if they were a puzzle she had solved 1,000 times before. Charles, who had been silently observing her, felt his pulse quicken. He had never seen anyone, let alone a passenger, take charge in such a way. Clara moved like she belonged here, her actions smooth and efficient, while Derek remained stunned. His disbelief had finally given way to a grudging respect, but he still couldn't quite understand how someone who didn't even look like she belonged on this flight had such intimate knowledge of the aircraft. Charles glanced at the radar. The screen blinked erratically, a pattern that was unmistakable to him. "Jamming," he muttered under his breath. The cockpit filled with a sudden unease, the realization that something far more dangerous than a storm was now at play. Clara's voice broke the silence, low and calm as ever. "Jamming. It's already started." Her words carried weight, though Derek couldn't shake the disbelief in his chest. "Jamming? In this storm?" he asked, his tone filled with confusion. He stared at the radar, trying to make sense of what Clara had said. It didn't add up. The idea of a signal being jammed in the middle of a storm seemed ludicrous, yet the evidence was right in front of him. Clara didn't answer, her focus on the flashing radar screen. Her hands moved deliberately, adjusting dials and flipping switches with a practiced precision. A faint beeping came from the instrument panel, signaling that the aircraft systems were under threat. The cockpit lights flickered again, and the temperature seemed to drop slightly as the air pressure fluctuated. The storm outside intensified, the wind screaming against the body of the plane. Derek turned to Charles. "Should we follow protocol?" he asked, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. The technician's orders to follow strict procedures still echoed in his mind, but in the face of what was happening, the protocol seemed to be an afterthought. Charles, who had been leaning forward in his seat, now sat back, his expression hardening as he watched Clara's actions. The tension between his instincts and the reality of the situation was palpable. "She's already done what we couldn't," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. For a moment, the cockpit was silent, save for the soft hum of the failing systems and the persistent crackle from the radio. The technician's voice came through again, though now there was a hint of urgency. "Captain, I repeat, no unauthorized personnel should be in control. We are running diagnostics on all systems. Follow protocol immediately." Clara didn't flinch. Her fingers continued their dance over the controls, adjusting them with the steady confidence of someone who had done this before. It was like she was reading the plane's responses in a language they couldn't understand, calm, methodical, and without hesitation. The radio crackled again, and the technician's voice, now tinged with frustration, cut through the air. "Captain, do not let an outsider touch the controls. We are in an emergency situation. You must follow procedures." But this time, Clara spoke. "Tell your team to stand by. I've got this." Her words were quiet, but there was an undeniable authority in them, as though everything had already been decided, and she was merely executing a plan that had been in motion for far longer than anyone in the cockpit could have imagined. The plane shuddered again, this time harder, and the right wing dipped slightly. The cabin below shook with the turbulence, causing the passengers to gasp and clutch their armrests. In row 7, a young boy sobbed into his mother's sweater, his voice muffled. The baby in row 12 cried louder, adding to the growing chaos in the cabin. As the plane lurched once more, Clara's eyes flicked to the control panel. She moved with a calm that contrasted with the instability around them. Her hands adjusted something on the radar, and the flickering display began to stabilize. For a brief moment, the turbulence eased. Charles and Derek exchanged glances. Both men knew that the flight was still far from stable. But in that moment, there was a palpable shift. The shaking had softened, the radar had regained its composure, and the sense of impending disaster had begun to recede, if only for a moment. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but in the cockpit, Clara was no longer just a passenger. She was the one in charge. And as the radio crackled once again, this time with confirmation from the ground team, there was no longer any question in anyone's mind. "Ghost talk is cleared. Proceed with her instructions," came the technician's voice, though it sounded more subdued, as if they too had finally accepted the inevitable. Derek, who had been silent up until now, let out a slow breath. His arms, which had been crossed in suspicion, now hung loosely at his sides. "I guess we follow her lead now," he muttered under his breath, not expecting anyone to hear him. Charles didn't reply immediately. Instead, he watched Clara, who was still focused on the controls, her hands steady and sure. There was something about her that was both unsettling and inspiring, something about the way she handled the situation with such calm certainty, even when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. The storm outside continued to howl, but in the cockpit, there was only the steady hum of the instruments and the quiet assurance of Clara's control. The turbulence had eased, and the flight had, for the moment, been stabilized. Clara had taken charge, and now, the entire plane seemed to be in her hands. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cockpit, a strange calm had settled. The instruments were no longer flickering erratically, the turbulence had lessened, and the hum of the plane's systems had returned to a stable rhythm. Clara stood at the center of it all, her hands gliding over the controls with effortless precision. Charles, the captain, sat back in his seat, watching Clara closely. Derek, the co-pilot, had stopped complaining. His skepticism had slowly morphed into something else, respect, perhaps even awe. The realization had finally set in. Clara wasn't just some passenger playing hero. She was the hero. And she was keeping them all alive. "Clara," Charles began, his voice soft but full of disbelief. "You're not just some regular civilian, are you?" Clara didn't look at him as she adjusted a dial on the console. Her focus was absolute, as if she were the only one in the world who could hear the pulse of the plane beneath her fingertips. She didn't answer his question, but her silence spoke volumes. Charles didn't need her to explain. He understood now. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, the mood was unraveling in a different way. The earlier mockery of Clara had transformed into a growing sense of unease among the passengers. A few people were still whispering, but now, their words had less bite. The businessman, Greg, who had been the loudest in ridiculing Clara, was now pacing the aisle, his face flushed with frustration. "I paid for first class," he shouted, his voice breaking through the tense silence in the cabin. "I shouldn't have to deal with this nonsense. Who does she think she is?" Greg's outburst was met with murmurs of disapproval from the other passengers. They were no longer laughing. The laughter that had once accompanied his mocking comments had faded into something heavier, an awkwardness, a reluctance to side with him now that the truth was becoming clear. In row 11, Rosa, the elderly woman who had been silently observing, clutched her rosary beads tightly, her fingers moving with an almost rhythmic prayer. She glanced at Greg, shaking her head softly. Her lips moved, though no one could hear her muttering words. It was clear she had already made up her mind. The young flight attendant, Leia, who had been in the galley when the chaos began, overheard Greg's rant and, for the first time, found her voice. She was nervous, her hands still trembled, but there was a newfound firmness in her words as she spoke, almost to herself. "She's not a nobody," Leia whispered, though the words were louder than she realized. The passenger sitting near her, a woman with a small child in her lap, overheard. She leaned forward, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "You're right," she said. "She's doing something none of us could." Leia, still shaking, nodded. Her eyes met the woman's, a small act of defiance against the cruelty that had surrounded Clara earlier. Her fingers steadied as she gathered up a tray of napkins that had scattered across the floor in the commotion, and for a moment, she felt a small spark of courage. Back in the cockpit, the radio crackled again. The technician's voice came through, sharp and insistent. "Captain, follow the protocol. This is not something you should be handling alone." Clara's fingers stilled as she listened, her eyes flicking to the readouts in front of her. The storm outside seemed to grow worse, and the plane tilted again, a slight shift in the right wing, sending another wave of panic through the cabin. The turbulence was still far from over. But Clara didn't flinch. Her eyes narrowed at the flickering lights and the distress signals on the instruments. "It's not the storm I'm worried about," she muttered under her breath, almost to herself. She adjusted a few more dials, her movements precise, almost instinctual. Harrington, the captain, exchanged a quick glance with Derek. There was nothing more they could do. They were waiting for Clara's lead. The minutes that followed felt heavy, thick with the uncertainty of what was to come. But Clara was focused, her mind running through the procedures she'd followed so many times before. The radio crackled again, and this time, it was not the technician, but a new voice, a voice that sent a ripple of shock through both the cockpit and the cabin. "Captain, we've confirmed ghost talk. Operation Echo Zero is clear to proceed." The words hung in the air, and the silence that followed was more powerful than any of the storm's noise. For the first time, Charles and Derek both realized the gravity of the situation. Clara wasn't just handling the aircraft. She was executing a mission. "I need 30 seconds of silence," Clara's voice broke through the momentary stillness, sharp and clear. Charles and Derek both nodded without hesitation. The cockpit fell quiet, and even the storm outside seemed to ease, as if honoring Clara's request. The only sound was the hum of the plane's instruments, now steady under her control. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the mood had shifted again. Passengers exchanged glances, uncertain of what was truly happening. The teenage boy in row 7, who had been filming the scene on his phone, stopped and turned to his sister. "This is for real," he muttered. His sister, who had been scrolling through her phone, stopped and looked at him. "Yeah, I know," she said quietly, her voice suddenly serious. "This isn't a movie. She's saving us." Greg, who had been ranting only minutes ago, had fallen silent. The woman in row 11, still clutching her rosary, began praying louder, her voice rising above the low murmur of the cabin. She could feel it, the change in the air. Something was shifting, something that would soon make everything clear. Back in the cockpit, Clara's hands moved with deliberate intent. The systems were stabilizing, and the aircraft was beginning to respond to her input. The plane's shuddering eased just enough for it to be noticeable. "You've got it," Charles murmured, his voice full of quiet reverence. Derek, his skepticism finally gone, nodded silently. And in that moment, everyone aboard the plane understood something. Clara was not just saving them from the storm. She was saving them from a danger much greater, a danger none of them had even seen coming. She was their guardian, and now, the world outside the plane was starting to understand that, too. As the turbulence gradually softened, the tension that had gripped the cabin began to fade. The sharp, rattling shakes had subsided, and the unrelenting storm outside no longer seemed as overwhelming. The plane's systems, once faltering and erratic, now hummed steadily. Clara's hands moved with practiced ease, adjusting the dials, her eyes never leaving the readouts on the instruments. Her calm was a quiet anchor in the chaos, a steady presence in a storm that had almost broken them all. Charles, the captain, leaned back in his seat, the knot of tension in his chest loosening for the first time in what felt like hours. He exchanged a brief look with Derek. Neither of them needed to speak. The job Clara had done in those few moments was nothing short of miraculous, and even the most hardened of professionals could see it. The radio crackled to life again, though this time, it was different. There was no more panic in the technician's voice, no more orders to follow protocol. It was almost as though the entire tone had changed, respect, if not full understanding, had seeped into the conversation. "Captain," the technician's voice said, now more controlled, "we've confirmed Ghost Talk's clearance. We're running diagnostics, but all systems are stable for now. Proceed with her input." Clara didn't acknowledge the confirmation. She didn't need to. She simply adjusted the final dial, and the cockpit fell into a quiet calm. It was clear now that the plane was in capable hands, and those hands belonged to the woman who had once seemed like just another nervous passenger. The shift had been subtle, but it had completely changed the mood in the cockpit. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the ripple of relief spread slowly. The passengers, who had been on edge, now found their tension easing. The noise from the back of the plane, the whispers, the murmurs, the occasional complaint, had died down. There was a new atmosphere in the air, one that was quieter, more reflective. Greg, the businessman from row 5, had stopped pacing. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced with a lingering unease. He sat back down, his face flushed but no longer with anger. The murmurs of the passengers around him were quieter, the judgment in their eyes now softened. The woman in row 10, the one who had whispered about Clara being a wannabe hero, was no longer speaking. Her eyes, once full of skepticism, had turned toward the front of the plane, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the cockpit door. Rosa, the elderly woman with the rosary, continued her prayers, but now they were softer, more measured. Her earlier anger had faded into something far gentler, acceptance, perhaps. She glanced at Clara's empty seat, her expression filled with something unspoken. Whatever it was clear that Clara had earned something from everyone who had been watching. Even the young flight attendant, Leia, who had quietly stood by the galley earlier, was now a different person. Her hands, once trembling, were steady as she moved down the aisle, checking on the passengers, offering reassuring words. When she passed by Greg, who had now slumped into his seat, his eyes focused downward, she offered him a small, sympathetic smile. For the first time since the chaos had started, there was a glimmer of understanding between them. In the back of the plane, the teenage boy who had been filming the entire ordeal on his phone now sat quietly, his phone forgotten in his lap. His sister, who had been scrolling through social media, looked at him, then back at the cockpit. "I told you she was real," she whispered. He nodded, still wide-eyed from the experience. I didn't think anyone could do that. Not like her." At that moment, the silence in the cabin was interrupted by the sound of the intercom crackling again. The voice on the other end was calm, steady, and professional, as though nothing unusual had happened. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," the voice said, and it was not Clara's but Charles's. "We've encountered some unexpected turbulence, but all systems are stable now. We are on course for our destination and expect a smooth landing." We ask that you remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened for the remainder of the flight." There was a brief pause before the captain added, "Thank you for your cooperation." The message was met with a sigh of relief from the cabin, but for some, the relief went beyond the flight's safety. There was something about the way the captain had spoken, his calmness, his authority, that seemed to reassure everyone that they were going to be okay. The storm outside might have been fierce, but the threat was over. The passengers shifted in their seats, some finally letting go of their grip on the armrests. The baby in row 12 had stopped crying, and the young boy in row 7 was no longer clutching his mother, though his small hand still rested in hers. Even Jason, the businessman who had mocked Clara, looked out of the window, his face softened by the realization that they had, in fact, been saved by a quiet, unexpected hero. In the cockpit, Clara finally relaxed her grip on the controls. The storm was still out there, but she had done what was necessary. The systems were stable, and the plane was on course. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need thanks. She had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. As the plane continued its steady course toward the runway, the passengers in the cabin, each in their own way, began to reflect on what had just happened. Some were still grappling with the confusion of it all, how a seemingly ordinary woman had risen to the occasion. Others were simply grateful that someone had the strength and calm to take control when it mattered most. Back in the cockpit, Clara's eyes softened as she glanced out the small window, watching the storm clouds part in the distance. The sky was clearing, and though she couldn't shake the heaviness of what she had carried, she knew the hardest part was over. The plane was almost on the ground now. And for Clara, the work was done. The plane descended smoothly toward the runway, its wings cutting through the air with a quiet grace. The storm outside had finally started to subside, the angry clouds giving way to a calm that seemed almost surreal after hours of chaos. The cabin, which had once been filled with tension and disbelief, was now eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the plane's engines. As they neared the airport, the runway lights began to glow brighter through the cockpit window. Clara's fingers hovered over the controls for the final adjustments, her focus sharp and steady. She had no need for any recognition, no desire for the spotlight. She had done what she came to do, nothing more, nothing less. And for her, that was enough. Charles, the captain, sat back in his seat, his hands resting loosely on his lap. He glanced at Derek, who still seemed to be processing everything that had happened. Derek's eyes, usually hard and cynical, now had a certain respect in them, something that had only been earned through the steady hands of the woman in the cockpit. He gave Clara a small nod, acknowledging her without needing to say a word. Clara's response was just as simple, a brief glance, nothing more, but it spoke volumes. Outside, the turbulence that had once rocked the plane was now just a distant memory, and as the plane touched down on the runway, it did so with an almost surreal smoothness. The landing gear kissed the tarmac, and the cabin erupted into a collective sigh of relief. The wheels of the aircraft rumbled against the ground, but the sound was like music to the passengers' ears after the long hours of uncertainty. Once the plane came to a full stop, a calm settled over the passengers. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and slowly, the passengers began to stir. Some, still in disbelief, checked their phones. Others whispered to each other, unsure of what had just transpired, but everyone was grateful to be on solid ground. The tension that had once gripped the cabin had dissipated, replaced by something gentler, relief. Clara gathered her things, slipping her sneakers back on and adjusting the strap of her cloth bag over her shoulder. She was one of the last to unbuckle her seatbelt and stand. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as though she were in no rush to leave. The reporters had not yet made their way into the terminal, but their voices would find her soon enough. She was about to be thrust into a world that would demand answers, and she wasn't prepared to give any. As Clara made her way down the aisle, the passengers still in their seats watched her. There was no applause, no grand gestures of thanks. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition that, despite her unassuming appearance, Clara had done something extraordinary. She had been their lifeline, their hero in a moment of crisis. When Clara reached the door, the flight attendants were waiting. Sarah, who had once questioned her presence, now gave Clara a small but genuine nod of respect. Clara didn't stop. She didn't need to. Her purpose on the flight had been fulfilled. Outside the plane, the runway was lined with emergency vehicles, their flashing lights adding to the chaos of the moment. Reporters were already crowding the tarmac, their cameras trained on the aircraft as passengers began to disembark. They had heard the rumors, the mysterious passenger who had taken control of the plane. They were waiting for answers, but Clara was already moving past them. The flashes of the cameras followed her, but Clara kept her head down, focusing on the ground as she walked. A reporter shouted her name, his voice rising above the others. "Ghost talk. Why didn't you say who you were? Why keep your skills hidden?" But Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. She was already walking past the crowd, her cloth bag still slung over her shoulder. The questions would not define her. She had done what she had come to do, and that was all that mattered. A quiet man in his 60s, a passenger who had been silent the entire flight, noticed something. He had seen the photo that Clara had kept hidden inside her bag. A young man in a pilot's uniform, smiling brightly, someone who had never had the chance to grow old. The man turned to his wife, his voice low but steady. "That's her son," he said softly, his eyes on Clara's retreating figure. "I read about him, system failure years ago." She warned them. But they didn't listen. His wife nodded, her eyes softening as she too understood. "That's why she's so quiet," she murmured. Clara's steps didn't falter as she left the terminal, the weight of the moment still heavy on her shoulders. She walked slowly, her feet light against the cold floor. She passed through the crowd of reporters, but their voices were nothing but background noise. They were chasing after answers, but Clara wasn't interested in giving them. The only thing that mattered to her was the photo tucked safely inside her bag, the photo of the young man, her son, the one who had been lost in the line of duty, the one the world had forgotten. Clara's fingers brushed against the edge of the frame as she walked, her mind still heavy with memories of a time she wished to forget. As she reached the doors of the airport, she paused for just a moment, looking up at the clear sky. Above, the city lights stretched out before her, twinkling in the distance like a promise. The storm had passed, and the world, though still loud and chaotic, felt a little quieter. A young boy, no older than 10, tugged at his mother's sleeve as he watched the crowd of special ops pilots and emergency responders raise their hands in salute as Clara passed. His voice was curious, yet innocent. "Mom, why is everyone standing so straight?" he asked, his gaze locked on Clara as she walked by. His mother looked at Clara, then back at her son. "Because some heroes," she said softly, "only need to be called once." Clara didn't hear the words. She didn't need to. She had already walked through the storm, and now, she was finally letting go. The weight on her shoulders, the burden of a past she had carried for too long, was slowly starting to lift. She had done her part. And that was enough. Thanks so much for watching, see you in my next video. Bye.